Hey folks, welcome to week number 2 of English 261, Introduction to Poetry. This week we'll be talking about Mary Oliver's, the first part of Mary Oliver's Rules for the Dance, but mainly we'll be focusing on the process of scansion and poetic mechanics in metrical poetry. So Oliver, I think, overall in the text makes a pretty good case for why it's important to learn about scansion and why it's important to learn about metrical poetry. Metric poetry, or metrically written poetry, though it does represent a kind of small subsection of the history of poetry in general, it's worth mentioning and it's worth being aware of because it does, I think, force us in a certain way to pay attention to language in a way we usually don't on a regular basis. It makes us think about the relationships between language and breathing. It makes us think about the relationships between language and rhythm and music and things along those lines, and it makes us think of the relationships between written language and sound and spoken language, which we don't really think about necessarily all that much on a regular basis, especially not in Western literature. In Western literature, we often focus on written and oral language is somehow two separate things, though really they're actually connected to one another. One of the things that I think that Oliver does a really good job of pointing out in her chapter about breath is that breath is about repetition, and so is metrical poetry. It's about using words in the same way we use breath, using a meter to some extent to actually create some sort of breath in the poetry. And I think that's it makes the kind of, I think on page 5, which talks about in the heavy stress at the end of each line, when she talks about bereft, each line somehow makes the silence of each line a precipitous and dangerous fall. I mean, the fact that the way we use stresses and the way we use metrical elements does have an impact on how we connect to poetry. And I think Oliver does a really good job of explaining overall that the tone and structure of a poem are as essential to meaning as the words and the content of the poem. And I think this is especially true in metrical poetry, and I think we can see a really great example of that when Oliver talks about iambic pentameter really being the structure of human language. The way we talk tends to be, we tend to speak in pentameter lines, and iambic pentameter tends to be fit in with more of the way we tend to stress things in the English language. So I think the tone and structure is really kind of essential too, and I think that one of the reasons that it's worthwhile to learn about metrical poetry, even if you're only using it to scan poems, or even if you're only using it to write metrical poems, is because the process of scanning poems and the process of writing metrical poems makes you more aware of how you're using language from a artistic standpoint in terms of a structural standpoint as well, which I think is kind of important, especially for those of you who are really interested in writing poetry, because really the choice of how you structure lines, what words you choose, how you place words, the tone you're creating with the language you use, these aren't arbitrary choices. They all have an effect on the reader, and that's something you have to be aware of when you're writing these kinds of things and where you're kind of reading them as well. So I think Oliver does a really kind of good job of explaining that, and I think she makes a really good case for studying metrical poetry, and also the part of the reason we're going to study metrical poetry is just because we're going to cover the area where metrical poetry is popular. So you're going to spend some time analyzing it, and you're also going to be writing some metrical poetry as well. So she talks about, and checks into on patterns. One of the things she kind of talks about here is that a metrical poem is just a pattern. And I think ultimately that's some useful information to have because the pattern, the repetition of the pattern, and the variations within that pattern are what create the meaning. Variation, I think, is something she does a really, really good job of covering here as well. A repetition of a pattern is important. In metrical poetry, but so are the occasional variations, as without variation, pattern doesn't mean as much. It's almost that idea that if there's nothing to disrupt the pattern, it's much harder to actually notice the pattern or appreciate the pattern until you get the disruption. And I think to some extent that's true of metrical poetry as well. It's the variation, it's the complexity of the pattern, I think, that makes it enjoyable more so than the simplicity of the pattern. And she does kind of talk about, when she talks about rhyme, overly simplistic rhyme, overly used masculine obvious rhyme, to a certain extent becomes kind of sing-songy and ultimately kind of distracts readers or gives it a far more lighthearted tone than the author might actually intend. So I think repetition, that kind of discussion here is useless, and the idea of repetition, variation, and patterns or something to definitely take away with this. And she talks about the three components that describe an overall rhyme scene, and I think that's worth mentioning and possibly making some notes of here. So the three components of a metrical poem. The first was rhyme, line length, and pattern. Okay, and I think that's definitely worth being aware of. And one of the things you probably notice as you're reading through this, and one of the things I'm actually going to work on today in this lecture, is just kind of going through and pointing out some of the vocabulary terms that Oliver gives us here. One of the things that happens in Rules of the Dance is Oliver gives us a far more in-depth discussion of Scansion than she gave us on poetry. So it's kind of a bit of an expansion of what those of you who took English 205 might already know, but it's definitely a worthwhile expansion because it's going to make us ultimately more effective when we actually come to scanning poems and writing our own poems. So she talks about the idea of a feat, or feat. Each line of a poem has measurable feet. And the feet, as Oliver points out here, what constitutes a feet, and each foot contains some sort of metrical pattern. And the examples she gives, the classic ones, are an iamb, a trochee, a dactyl, or an anapest. And if you actually take a look at this, you kind of flip through here and you take a look at her notes here. She shows iambic pentameter. Okay. One of the things she points out is more often than not, a foot is actually defined by a heavy stress. Most feet have a heavy stress, unless you've got a spondy or something along those lines. But she talks about each of the syllables in a foot. Is either each of the syllables in a word is accounted for in Scansion, and they are assigned as stressed or unstressed. And if you actually read the little footnote, the stressed syllables are marked with what she called the macaron, which is that little apostrophe mark, or a breve, which is the little smiley face. And also, if there's actually nothing stressed or unstressed, the two have equal measure. You use the little dash line and create a spondy. But that's something she kind of points out here a little bit later on here. So now, and here's what I was looking for when I was looking around here a minute ago. Each foot is constructed of a single emphasis plus details. That is one heavy stress and no more, and whatever light stresses are needed to make up the chosen pattern. So each foot has only one stressed syllable or word, but can vary in terms of unstressed syllables or words. And these extra words determine the type of foot in the pattern. Now, of course, if something has equal weight, you end up with a spondy. So that's actually not entirely true, as she kind of goes on to explain. But it's important to realize that that is something to there, and you can actually use that quite effectively. So if you take a look at 12, she actually goes through the names of the metrical lines according to length. So the 1 foot line is called the monometer, a 2 foot line is called the diameter, trimeter, tetrameter, pentameter, hexameter, heptameter, octameter. As she said before, pentameter tends to be the length of the human breath. It's where we feel like we don't have much left in us, but we're also not winded. So that's kind of what she says, that tends to be a kind of important to realize. The metrical pattern she talks about is the IM. That's the light stress followed by the heavy stress. The trochee is a heavy stress followed by a light stress. Dactyl is a heavy stress followed by 2 light stresses. And the anapest is the 2 light stresses followed by the heavy stress. And she talks about, to a certain extent, variations appear in these patterns in terms of line length, things along those lines. And generally, most poems will, the great number of poems will use more than one of the 2 types. So, yeah, and the iambic pentameter is a little bit different. There's a lot of poems that are purely pentameter, but there tends to be variation in metrical poems. So sometimes you might end up with a tetrameter line followed by a pentameter line, or whatever it might be, and then you might have variations in the actual type of feet you're using within those lines. And I think she's got a good note here that says, a question how much substitution allowed is unanswerable. At a certain point, substitution becomes so frequent that it's actually violated the pattern, so people aren't actually following it or recognizing the pattern anymore. On the other hand, some substitution is actually beneficial because it keeps the poem from becoming sing-songy. She points out that to some extent trochaic, dactyl, and anapest always will feel a little bit unnatural. They'll announce themselves in a way that an iambic line will, because iambic line tends to follow the rhythms of natural speech. So she does point that out when she talks about these different types. And a dactyl, she says, for example, is a little bit more follows the line of the iambic. You'll feel that a little bit because we do have quite a few of those languages. The anapest is, again, and it's anything other than the iamb is kind of composed and formalized to some extent. And then she talks about the spondy, which is the emphasis within the foot is equally balanced, so you just use the 2 little horizontal lines over the top. Okay. So, and she talks about pentameter kind of creating a useful flow. It's an iambic pentameter writes you to move through the lines in a way because they're almost like the lines of human breath and human speech. They're kind of relaxing, they're kind of comfortable, they're kind of fit us very, very well. And she kind of talks about how these things are read, and I think this is useful information to kind of think about, is what the effect of a trochee might have in a place as opposed to an iamb, or an anapest as opposed to a dactylic line. I think that's kind of an important kind of thing to think about. And she talks about the trochee is effectively a quick leap compared to an iamb. It forces some sort of a jump. And she also talks about this to some extent when she talks about the mutes, the hard Ks at the end of lines, or the Ps, or things like that, that kind of create a pause in the speech. They don't flow into one another the way the other words do. She talks about pure and impure meter. Oh, yeah, let's talk about masculine and feminine. That's worth mentioning as well. Words that end with a light stress are referred to as feminine words, and words that end with a heavy stress are referred to as masculine words. And why this goes back to a long history of patriarchy and sexism that's well, definitely important to be aware of, but not necessarily it goes back to also to the Latin, which actually has feminine words and masculine words. If you study in the Romance languages, there are masculine and feminine forms for words. It goes back a long, long time, and it goes back to patriarchy and the mistreatment of women and all kinds of different issues. Here, I don't think that Oliver isn't endorsing the usage of the terms in any way, shape, or form. She's just pointing out that these are what they're called in the English language by linguists. So to be aware of. Words that end with the light stress are called feminine words. Words that end with heavy stress are masculine words. And she also talks about if meter is totally regular, it is pure meter. And if the meter has variations, it's impure meter. And she talks about poems and she says by impure what I'm talking about is not the variety of meter or substitution of one meter for another, even though the feminine tag, but if instances are in one or more feet, there's substantial alteration from the very specific recognizable pattern. So if there's a variation from the pattern, you end up with impure meter. Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forest of the night. There's a switch there. The catalexis. And catalexis is the truncation of the final foot. As in the foot doesn't complete in relation to the rest of the foot. And that's called a catalectic line. For example, the example he uses is tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night. If you look, you'll actually notice the last two lines of there are actually catalexis because they're not actually trochees like the other feet. They're just kind of half trochees. So bright and night are standalone as syllables. They're truncated lines or catalectic lines. So, and then she talks about a lame line, or a lame foot. Occurs when the foot lacks a syllable. So generally speaking, syllables almost always have at least, most feet will have two syllables. If it has just one syllable, it's called a lame foot. All right? And she also points out that a lame foot does not necessarily create a catalexis, especially if the syllable's incorrect. So the example she uses here is the Edna St. Vincent Millay's Moratorius on page 24, if you're following along with me here. She's got the breve, macron, so she's using iambs throughout, iambs or anapests throughout here to a great extent. Let me make sure I got the term right here. Yep, so she's using iambs and anapests fairly frequently throughout this, but then at the end she gets, you might have a line like shard or snug, which are on their own, so they're actually not technically catalexis because they do actually fall in with the pattern to some extent, but they're not, but they're actually lame feet because they're down to single syllable. Okay? And she points out that even lame feet can be meaningful and graceful, which is kind of a lovely line. And a foot with too many syllables to fit with one of the recognizable patterns is called a hypersyllabic foot. And then, of course, there's an example of the anacrusis, which is the over too many syllables at the beginning of the foot, such as that O in front of something. There's all kinds of different terminology she gives here. So, for example, there's the Pyrrhic foot, which is composed of two light stresses. It appears in Greek and Roman poetry. So, for example, beach fish, like a beach fish. In English verse, only appears immediately followed by a spondee, so it's tied into that, and the 2 feet together become a double ionic. So all of these kinds of terms. There's the other one that we want to be aware of is the caesura, which is a pause or break in the middle of the line. And in these, they're often created by a punctuation. So you'll notice there's commas in the middle of the line. If there's a comma, that usually means a pause. That creates a caesura. Okay? And one thing she does point out is that in the employment of each of these embellishment opportunities, the inflection of these lines always follows a pattern of natural speech. It never, never betrays the correct pronunciation of any word. So there are variations in the way we pronounce words, but never will someone force a word to be pronounced incorrectly simply for the fact to make the line work. So keep that in mind as you're kind of going through here. That if you're, and this is something to be aware of when you're writing poems as well, you'll sometimes notice I'll leave a note on your work that says this line feels forced. What that means is that you've tried too hard to cram something into a pattern, that it's actually the line doesn't work anymore, or I'm not getting this reading, or something along those lines. I mean, there's all kinds of different variations on it. If you have to force or change the pronunciation of the word to make it fit the meter, you need to find a different word, or you need to recognize there's going to be some sort of variation in the meter and kind of consider it that way. So she talks about line lengths and how they influence mood. All that stuff is information and very useful to have. We talked about this to some extent in English 205. Pentameter leads to kind of a meditative kind of conversational feel. Tetrameter is good for stories where there's action, so you make it a little bit shorter. Heptameter, they kind of give an abundant, kind of overjoyous, powerful feeling. She also, one of the things I always like about Oliver, and I think it's worth mentioning, if you look at page 34 at the bottom, there's a little knock on Poe here. She makes a few of those here, takes little knocks at Poe. The Raven, there's a little feeling of natural speech, which is not all Poe's aim at any time. And what she points out is that Poe is always trying to make the artifice stand out, and one of the ways he does that is by having these massive lines that have nothing to do with actual human speech. And that's also a way of announcing the writing as opposed to focusing on breath or discussion. Poetry in its original form was meant to be read, so when we start getting into those very long lines, at that point we're kind of moving away from the way people would generally read. And I believe, yeah, the 6-foot line made up of only iambic feet is called an Alexandrine. That's important to be aware of simply because we'll be reading some poems by Pope, who really, really likes Alexandrines. And she talks about release of energy along the line, how the anapestic can start something with a little bit of energy and how energy works in lines. Iams tend to be pretty consistent. Trochees create those little jumps. Anapests create those energies. She kind of talks about different ways that the meter kind of changes things. And I think all that stuff is useful to know. And I think to some extent, one of these things you're going to want to do is you're going to want to revisit this as we're kind of going through and reading some of these poems, especially when we're tracking metrical poetry, to kind of think about how these variations are influencing how we're reading the poem. She talks about rhyme as a design. So that actually starts in part 6 on page 40. That's definitely worth taking a look at. She talks about the couplet, which is the two lines rhyming together. True rhyme, which is perfect rhyme, in which the words rhyme exactly. I'll kind of make some more notes and terms here. Pure / true rhyme is when words rhyme exactly. And there's also masculine rhyme, which is true rhyme with heavily stressed syllables. And the examples she gives are bright and night. Rhyme between words ending with light stressed syllables creates feminine rhyme. Again, same deal as before. And the force is lighter, and that tends to be also true rhyme as well. And he talks about the couplet. The heroic couplet. She talks about different variations in this. She talks about enjambment, where if there's no actual punctuation or nothing actually ends at the end of the line, it kind of pushes you to read on the next line quickly. That kind of creates a meter effect between lines. But one of the ways that she talks about is the way lines are marked. So that usually rhyme is created at the end of a line, especially when you're looking at rhyme in relation to line to line. It's and you number them or letter them as they go. Then she talks about imperfect rhyme, which is slant rhyme. So that would be clack and bleak are slant rhymes. So there's some sort of syllable connection. Some connection is made between the two words, but it is not true rhyme by any mean. Okay. There's double rhyme, all different kinds of variations on how rhyme works. The four-line stanza, the quatrain, just different variations. And then there's blank verse, which she points out is traditionally iambic pentameter without rhyme, and blank verse tends to happen quite a bit. She also then goes in to talk about forms, and this kind of information is useful. We'll be actually working with some forms over the semester. They're going to come up again and again and again. One of the things that I think is also kind of important to realize is she talks about in the section 8, which starts on page 57, just some other language devices. So alliteration. It's a repetition of initial sounds of words within a line. So, for example, she gives a number of those. Assonance is repetition of vowel sounds of words within a line. Or from stretching onto multiple lines, but usually it is within a line. That's where you start to declare assonance. There's also onomatopoeia, which is words that sound like the other words. Then she talks about the mutes, the quick wax of sounds, the liquids, how they kind of flow into one another. Then she talks about how using meter and non-metric verse can also help create a sense of intent, things along those lines. The O's and the A's, the anacrusis kind of structures, those things come in the beginning. And then she talks about kind of image making, a figurative language, similes, metaphors, things like that. We've talked about these in English 205. If you don't necessarily know them, just look up figurative language. You can find all kinds of information on them. But one of the things I think I really want to talk about, and I think it's really important to mention is the idea of, when she talks about on page 73, she talks about the physical world. She talks about kind of how we're losing the ability to recognize illusions and things like that. But I think one of the things I really want to point out here is she makes the claim that poetry is not something that lives on the page. It's meant to live in the world. And I think that's a very kind of important idea to think about. And I think what she means by that is more or less, when we read poems, what we really want is we want to feel them in the way we would feel a lived experience. We don't want to just have something written on a page. It should rise up off the page, and it should become something deeper than just words written on a page. It should become something in the world itself. And I think that's something very kind of interesting to take away from this. And it's something to think about when you're writing your own poems, especially always kind of stress the idea of show, don't tell. And I think the reason I tend to stress that quite so heavily is simply for the fact that when you're showing instead of telling, you're actually doing a much better job of making something leave off the page. It's not just someone telling you something. It's a lived experience. It's a felt experience. It exists in the world in a way something you're just telling someone doesn't. So I think that's something kind of important to think about as we go forward, is how these poems are living beyond the page or beyond the words they're written with or beyond the structure they're used. How are they kind of living things, and how are they kind of living off of the page? How are they getting at newness? How are they getting at interesting ideas? So I think that's something to take consider as well. Now, before I finish the lecture today, something I'm going to do is I'm actually going to practice a scansion, so you can see how I do it, and you can also see how much I still fumble with it. Scansion, I am not someone who's a musical person. For those of you who are musical, you'll probably find Scansion quite a bit easier than those of us who are not musical. Scansion is work for me, so you'll get to kind of see me go through the process. You'll get to see me do things like count syllables with my fingers. You'll get to see me keep looking up terminology because I don't always remember it off the top of my head, but you will get to kind of see me scan, and it'll be a kind of a way for you to see, first of all, how you might want to go about it, but also to kind of give you a sense of how I go about it. And if you actually take a look in the course modules for this week, you will actually see a little thing called Scansion, the Basics, a quick guide. And it kind of gives you some tips for how to go about scanning. And when you read the next part of Oliver, she'll actually take a look at how to do it as well. So the steps as we go here, and we're going to go ahead and do this on the poem One Art by Elizabeth Bishop, because it's one of my favorite poems. It's something we'll read later on as well. But let's see if I can get the document cam up. There we go. Okay, so you can see my copy of One Art by Elizabeth Bishop. And let's see if I can zoom this in a little bit. We'll turn the light on here. Ah, there we go. Sorry, one of my first times playing with one of these things. Kind of interesting. Okay. Apparently you can't move these things around all that much when they're in the process. Zoom out a little bit. I think it's trying to catch up. Well, let's see if we switch back to the computer if it'll do anything. Okay, now let's switch back to the document camera. There we go. So the first step, if you're looking at the Scansion guide, which is actually a pretty helpful way to kind of approach Scansion, is to just kind of read the poem aloud. So it kind of helps you understand the rhythm. So I'll read it. The art of losing isn't hard to master. So many things seem filled with the intent. To be lost, their loss is no disaster. Lose something every day, except the fluster of lost door keys, the hour badly spent. The art of losing isn't hard to master. Then practice losing farther, losing faster, places and names and where it was you meant to travel. None of these will bring disaster. I lost my mother's watch, and look, my last or next to last of the 3 loved houses went. The art of losing isn't hard to master. I lost 2 cities, lovely ones, and, vaster, some realms I owned, 2 rivers, a continent. I missed them, but it wasn't a disaster. Even losing you, the joking voice, a gesture I love, I shan't have lied. It's evident the art of losing's not too hard to master, though it may look like, write it, like disaster. Okay, so then what it says to do is count the number of syllables. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll count the syllables across the lines. So here we've got the art of losing isn't hard to The art of losing isn't hard to master. So The art of losing isn't hard to master. So I'm getting 11 syllables in this line. Okay. So many things seem filled with the intent. So many things seem filled with the intent. So I get 10 here. To be lost, that their loss is no disaster. And I get 11 here. Lose something every day except the fluster. 11 here. Of lost door keys, the hour badly spent. 10 here. The art of losing, well, that's a repetition of the last one, so clearly we're going to have 11 syllables there. Then practice losing farther, losing faster. 11. Places and names and where it was you meant. Places and names and where it was you meant. That's 10. To travel. None of these will bring disaster. 11. I lost my mother's watch and look my last, or 11. Next to last of 3 loved houses went. That's 10. The art of losing isn't hard to master. 11 again. I lost 2 cities, lovely ones and vaster. I lost 2 cities, lovely ones and vaster. Yep, 11. Some realms I owned, 2 rivers, a continent. Some realms I owned, 2 rivers, a continent. That's 11. I missed them, but it wasn't a disaster. Even losing you, the joking voice, a gesture. I love. I shan't have lied. It's evident. 10. The art of losing's not too hard to master. 11. Though it may look like, write it like disaster. Okay, so I've counted out the syllables, and to be fair, I mean, that's kind of a loose approximation. I might have missed a thing or two here, and if I really, really wanted to get really, really serious about this, what I would do is I would break out a dictionary to set it up that way. And that will actually kind of give you the direct pronunciation of how many syllables are in there. And you can find an online dictionary or something along those lines if you want to do that. What I would do then is it says denote the syllables as unstressed or stressed. So the art, so we'll use the brief for the stressed and unstressed, of losing isn't hard to master. So, so many things seem filled. So many things seem filled with the intent. So many things seem filled with the intent. Okay. So many things seem filled with the intent. To be lost. That their loss is no disaster. Okay. So you're getting those little extra syllables on there, which, if we look back at our notes, was called... We could actually call that a hypersyllabic foot, because we've got the stress here. So we've got hypersyllabic feet on these last ones. So lose something every day. Except the fluster of lost door keys, the hour badly spent. So then we've got a catalectic line. So it doesn't seem that necessarily she's using a pattern of stresses. So there's not necessarily a stress pattern, but there definitely is a line length pattern here. So we can kind of see some variation in that. So it doesn't look like it's probably using blank verse or a blank kind of verse. There's not necessarily a pattern of respondents. There's variations within that pattern. So there's no necessarily a hard pattern here. There is a pattern, though, of syllables and feet. So it is definitely a syllabic poem to some extent. So the other thing you can do is you'll also notice there's a fair amount of caesura here, too. So many things seem filled with the intent to be lost or lost is no disaster. So that one goes first. Lose something every day. You've got a caesura here, except the fluster of lost door keys. The hour badly spent. The art of losing isn't hard to master. Then practice losing farther, losing faster, places and names and where it was you meant to travel. We got an enjambment here at speed on to the next line. And look, my last or next to last of the three beloved houses went. Okay. So we've got that kind of structure going on here. And if we go down here, the last thing you take a look at really is repetitive rhyme. So, master and disaster would both be A, intent and spent. Fluster and master and disaster all rhyme. So ABA, 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 gesture, and then A, B, A. Okay, now, if you looked in the book, you'd actually know that this is already set up to be a villanelle. So if you take a look at what the requirements of the pattern are to be a villanelle, and you look under the forms, let's see here. If we look at the form section. Here we go. It's a poem of the villanelle, originally still a French form, is a poem of 19 lines set out in 5 tercets and a final quatrain, and it's got the pattern of A, B, A, 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 A. Okay? Poem works in 1/3 lines, and that's really the only expectation from a villanelle. They're usually, but not always, an iambic pentameter. And for the most part, she's using in a pentameter structure, and there is quite a bit of iambic pentameter here, but there's definitely variations within it. So this is recognizably a villanelle with some variation on it. Now, does it really mean anything necessarily that's a villanelle? No, but it does kind of give us an identifiable form to work with. What would matter if we were really spending time to get really deep into analyzing this poem is analyzing how these things work to create structure and meaning, and how, for example, she uses things to slow down or to kind of think about the things that are lost before speeding through the idea that none of this is going to matter. The art of losing isn't hard to master. It's something you can pick up easily, whereas the things you lose you have to pause for and you have to think about those. The loss of them is not easy, but losing it itself is quite easy, which is something you can kind of read into the way the poem is structured. But you get a general sense of how Scansion works. And this is something we're going to practice throughout the semester. And it does take a little bit of work, and it does take a little bit of time. And there's variations on what people might say is stressed and what isn't stressed. For example, some people might stress, I say door is stressed more than keys. But you could arguably say that door, keys, is actually has the harder syllable, so keys is actually the word that was stressed, but I would stress door. So it's kind of an iambic pentameter kind of discussion of what you could have with it. Or you could also argue about where does a word split and how many syllables it might actually have. But scansion's kind of a useful ability just to kind of get a sense of how a poem works. Also, scansion is something you're going to have to practice when you're working in a given form, because you're going to want to make sure that your poem is actually fitting the structure of the form and you're actually writing in metric verse. All right? So it's something that's a work in progress. It's something we keep working on through the entire semester. We started in 205. We'll continue doing it here. But it's definitely something that's going to take some time for you to pick up. All right? So that's kind of what I want to talk about today in terms of scansion. As to what you'll be doing for this week, if you go ahead and take a look at the module for week 2, and you will see that week 2... I want you to finish reading Oliver. You don't have to read the anthology if you don't want to. If you do want to, let me bring it back to the computer here. You don't have to read the anthology if you don't want to, but if you do want to read the anthology, I recommend it. It's a great anthology. You're going to read From Beowulf and the Norton. The Norton book is this one right here. There are some selections of the Beowulf that you'll be reading. Read From the Seafarer in Norton, and read the anonymous lyrics of the 13th and 14th century in the Norton section. These are very kind of early poems. I'll be talking a bit more about them next week. But also this week you're going to start working in the flash epic poem, because the Beowulf and the Seafarer are actually kind of both early English epic poems, and you're actually going to be writing a flash epic poem. I call it a flash epic poem for the simple fact that it shouldn't be any more than 25 lines of verse. We're going to take the form of flash fiction. Usually epic poems go on rather lengthy lengths. But here is a flash epic poem. So over the next 2 weeks you're going to be working on this one. It's your first poetry project. Read the assignments for it. It's not particularly difficult. I'm not going to get too upset about meter in this one, because the early epic poems were not necessarily metric. There is some blank verse you might find, things along those lines. But if you want to go ahead and start using things like blank verse or start playing with meter, I would recommend it. It's a fun thing to do. Try and use things like heroic couplets, kind of play around with it. And in your 25 lines, have fun and do something kind of interesting. And it should tell a complete story is one of my restrictions for it. And it should be about adventure or bravery at some point. So kind of play around and have some fun with it. Okay? All right, so that's what we're going to be working on for the next couple of weeks, is writing your flash epic poem. I'll go ahead and start grading the first assignments. You'll have some reading to do this week. Make sure you finish that little last section of Oliver, and next week we'll start talking about the poems and writing poems, things along those lines. All right, so that's it for this week. If you have any questions or concerns, please let me know. Otherwise, have a great week. I'll see you folks soon and talk to you again in about 7 days.